لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم: ادعوهم لآبائهم هو أقسط عند الله فإن لم تعلموا آباءهم فإخوانكم في الدين ومواليكم وليس عليكم جناح فيما أخطأتم به ولكن ما تعمدت قلوبكم وكان الله غفورا رحيما. صدق الله العظيم. فقال النبي الكريم صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم: لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من ولده ووالده والناس أجمعين أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. أما بعد. The Prophet's example for us is, of course, the thing that we have to look to in moments of doubt. In our Wednesday Khatira, we talked about this idea that there is often a conception that people have of what civilized is, of what the right behavior is. And in truth, the right behavior, the most civilized behavior, the most correct behavior is that of the Prophet ﷺ. And one of the ways that we have to be able to follow that example, to be able to stay steadfast, to make sure that we are connecting to him ﷺ, is to look to the example of his companions who followed him. Because the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they were individuals who he made very clear were to be followed after he was gone. Usikum bi ashabi, he said. I leave you with my companions, or I adjure you, but specifically I want you to look to the example of my companions. Focus on them. See what they did. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. Then look at those who learned from them and those who learned from them. And what this tells us is that the Prophet ﷺ is making a very clear hierarchy. The companions of the Prophet ﷺ are the ones to follow. They are, after his death, after his time, the people who everyone should look to in order to understand what it is they need to do. And before I continue, I'm going to ask anybody who's on their phone to put it away or step outside. If the brothers can tap the brothers on their phone there and ask them to please step off their phones. Inshallah. We can wait. You want to tap? So, when we understand that the Prophet ﷺ has made it very clear that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were to be followed, then we know that their example is something for us to look at, to follow. But what's beautiful about them is that in spite of them being such high-ranking people, such great individuals, they were clearly not a monolith. They were not simply a large group of people who all acted and did the same thing. They were varied. They were different. You know, in a cult, you have people who often try to look the same. They try to make sure that everything they do is exactly the same. They dress the same, they move the same, they talk the same words. And while we follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ, we do not all do things in a way that's a monolith. And the companions of the Prophet ﷺ also were not a monolith. They were not individual, they were individual in who they were. And they were as varied, if not more, than the society that we live in today. We had companions who were tall and strong. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh. We also had companions who were shorter, smaller, frailer. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh. You had companions who were harsh and forceful. We see that the Prophet ﷺ's companions, Abu Dharr al-Ghifari radiallahu anh, he was someone who was very harsh, very sharp. He held people to a very high standard. But then there were companions of the Prophet ﷺ who were very soft, very gentle. They didn't like to cause harm to people. They didn't like to cause difficulty with others. There were companions of the Prophet ﷺ who were pious and calm. They could restrain themselves. They could hold themselves back because their taqwa was something that always kept churning within themselves. And there was also companions who were very brash, who were very angry, who got upset even saying things out of mistakenness, not realizing who it was, to the Prophet ﷺ. A woman was once grieving, and the Prophet ﷺ came over and he said to her that just have sabr, be patient. And she said, go away, you don't know my pain, not knowing who it was. And when she went to the Prophet ﷺ, he gave her a lesson. He taught her something, that as-sabru inda sadmatil ula, that patience, sabr, true sabr, not just patience, but true sabr, is at the moment when things are truly occurring. And so what we see is that the companions were not all just a bunch of people who did the same thing and acted the same way and all were super pious and righteous. Some of them had things that they did that were not okay, at least from the Shari'i perspective. Some of them were punished for that. Some of them were held to account for that. But they were, because of the fact that they weren't protected from sin, that they didn't always do the right thing, that they maybe made mistakes much more often than everybody else, than other prophets, or than prophets, this actually does something for us, which is that it allows us to recognize that you can be somebody who Allah is pleased with and not be a perfect person. You can be somebody who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with and not do the things that you're supposed to do all the time. You can make mistakes. Nu'ayman ibn Amr radiyallahu an, we say, may Allah be pleased with him. This is a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. He was caught many times drinking publicly, and he was given the punishment for it. But when we say Nu'ayman ibn Amr, we're not talking about your buddy Nu'ayman, if you know anyone like that. We're not talking about the guy down the street. We're talking about someone who met the Prophet ﷺ and said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa annaka Rasulullah. That's who we're talking about. And in that, the Prophet ﷺ, his example for the companions, and then telling us to take them as an example, this is important then that we look at those companions. Who were they? How do we know them? Can we know them? And that's why, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, moving forward, we're going to have a series about the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Looking at their lives, seeing what it is that made them so special, what it is that allowed them to be able to become the people that they were. It won't be every khutbah, but it's something we're going to start as a series. And every companion has lessons that we can learn from their lives. The Prophet ﷺ said, أَصْحَابِكَ النُّجُومِ بِأَيِّهِمْ اِقْتَدَيْتُمْ اِهْتَدَيْتُمْ. My companions are like the stars. Whichever ones you choose or select or look to, you can get guidance from them. You're going to be able to find the right path. And the first thing I want to remind all of us is, we always hear this complaint or we hear this conversation, why do we have madhabs, why do we have this? If you really truly know the background of Islam, you understand what it is that we as an ummah have developed, you understand that the madhahib are built off of the contributions of companions of the Prophet ﷺ. That Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, and what he practiced and what he taught is what has been distilled into the Hanafi fiqh. That Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, that he is what he used to teach Nafi', his freed slave, this was then passed down to Malik ibn Anas, which is the Maliki madhab. So we understand that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, even amongst themselves, they had differences. Like I said, not a monolith. But there is a lot of value to looking to their lives. Today, what I wanted to start, the first companion I wanted to look to was a man who the Prophet ﷺ, in fact, for a large portion of his life, considered to be like his son. Not like his son, but considered to be his son. Zaid ibn Haritha, radiallahu anhu. And Zaid ibn Haritha's story is fascinating because as a young boy, when he went to visit family, he was there with his mother in a village, and the village was raided. And these raiders took him and sold him into slavery. And then he was purchased by a nephew of a woman who all of us have heard of, Khadija radiallahu anha. And this individual who purchased this Zayd radiallahu anha, he took it and gave it as a gift to his aunt. And Khadija radiallahu anha, she used to, have Zayd as her slave, and she used to keep him in this manner, and until the time where she got married. And when she got married, she gave Zayd radiallahu anha as a gift to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, he kept Zayd with him in a manner that was so beautiful that Zayd, number one, having lived now a large chunk of his life in slavery, he met some people in the city of Mecca who were from his tribe. And he sent a message with them that, let my family know that I'm okay. I'm alive, everything's fine, all is good with me. And his father and his uncle, when they got this message, they came rushing to the city of Mecca. And they said, where is Zaid? We want to take our son back. He's not a slave. He shouldn't be in slavery. Why is he this? We want him back. The Prophet ﷺ brought Zaid. He said, he's welcome to go with you. There is nothing stopping him. There is no reason that you should feel like he needs to be kept here. I'm not going to fight you on this. Zaid is welcome to go with you. But Zaid himself says, no, I don't want to go back. He said, I have seen things from this man that I have never seen from any other person. I want to stay with him. I want to stay with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is before prophethood. And so when Zaid makes this declaration and he now is freed, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam frees him at this time, Zaid's father, he says, if you're happy, I'm happy. And he leaves. And in the Arab custom, the Prophet ﷺ, because he was still young, he adopts him. And the Arab custom was that he would take the name of the one who adopted him. So Zaid ibn Haritha became Zaid ibn Muhammad. And he would go and people would recognize that Zaid is an individual who is inheriting from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Muhammad would inherit from him if something happened to him. This was the case for years and years and years into prophethood. And the Prophet ﷺ is teaching people, he's giving the message, he is working. Zayd radiallahu anhu is one of the first to believe in him when the message comes. He is amongst the first to accept Islam. And Zayd radiallahu anhu, he goes on in a way that is beautiful because the Prophet ﷺ always has Zayd accompanying him. When he goes to Al-Ta'if and the Prophet ﷺ is repelled from the people of Ta'if, they push him out, they stone him, they make him bleed. Zayd radiallahu anhu was trying to defend the Prophet ﷺ. He's trying to guard him, but he's getting pelted, he's getting hit in the head. The Prophet ﷺ said, Zayd, stop, just go ahead, get out of here. And he himself walked, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Zayd radiallahu anhu had this outsized presence in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. He was, for all he knew, the way the society he lived in told him that he was now the son of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So then what happens not long after is that the Prophet ﷺ makes a call to Zayd. He says, Zayd, I think you should marry this woman, Zainab bint Jahsh, who is the first cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. And Zainab radiallahu anha, she at first kind of doesn't want to. She's not really interested. She says, listen, I'm from Quraysh. She's saying that I am higher ranking, so to speak. My societal class level is better. And Zayd radiallahu anhu, he doesn't really care. He says, Ya Rasulullah, if you want me to do it, I'll do it, but I'm not going to force anything. And Zainab radiallahu anha, she just doesn't, she's not really willing to because she says, I'm a woman of Quraysh. I should marry someone from Quraysh. Until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the verses that when Allah and His Messenger have decreed something, it is not appropriate that people should think that they have a choice now. It's not for you to say, oh yeah, I want to do this and I'm going to do this, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, do this. So Zainab radiallahu anha, she says, okay, you know what? That's a good point. I agree. She accepts the marriage with Zayd radiallahu anhu. And in the interim then, what has occurred is that Zayd ibn Muhammad has been reverted back to Zayd ibn Harith. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals these verses where He makes it very clear that when you have an individual who has been adopted, they should be referred to by their father's name. أُدْعُوهُمْ لِآبَائِهِمْ هُوَ أَقْسَطُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. They should be referred to by the name of their father. In our times today, this is a bit more complicated. It's not as clear-cut as having a last name, middle name, this and that. There's levels to this. But regardless, what we understand here is that the Prophet ﷺ is made clear. It's made clear to him that no, it is not appropriate to refer to them as Ibn such and such. It should not be Ibn Muhammad. It should revert back to Ibn Haritha. Now, you put yourself in the shoes of Zayd radiallahu anh. You have been a faithful follower of the Prophet ﷺ. But more than a follower, you have been his son. You have been in a position of closeness that very few people have ever been. And you have this level of connection to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that nobody else will have the opportunity to get. And then all of a sudden, what happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals verses and says, this is not appropriate. And now this connection you had to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has been taken away. Not that there's anything wrong with being Ibn Haritha, but it's a big deal to be Ibn Muhammad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, however, says that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men. Because all the children who the Prophet ﷺ had, the boys, in fact, all the children the Prophet ﷺ had passed before he himself passed away, except one, Fatima radiallahu anha. And so, Zaid radiallahu anha has this honor taken away from him. And now he is back to Ibn Haritha. And he does marry Zainab, but it doesn't work out between them. They have difficulty in their marriage, and eventually, after a period of a couple of years, they divorce. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet ﷺ to marry Zainab bint Jahsh. To make it clear that the lineage, the idea of lineage as it relates to a son versus an adopted son, the rules of having a mahram don't apply the same way. And so when the Prophet ﷺ marries Zainab, this crystallizes this distinction. And the Prophet ﷺ then is in a position where his former son, if you will, has now divorced this woman. He's had to marry her based on the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does Zayd get out of this entire deal? Because it seems like things are just being taken away from him. It seems like there's just stuff that he was given, but it was removed from him. There's one thing in particular that Zayd radiallahu anh is granted as an honor that no other companion of the Prophet ﷺ received. When you open the Quran, you go to the 400s and you open Surah Al-Ahzab. There's a verse, وَإِذْ تَقُولُ لِلَّذِي أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَأَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِ أَمْسِكْ عَلَيْهِ زَوْجَكَ وَاتَّقِ اللَّهَ وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ مَا اللَّهُ مُبْدِيهِ وَتَخْشَى النَّاسَ وَاللَّهُ أَحَقُّ أَنْ تَخْشَاهُ. Allah reveals these verses and then He says, فَلَمَّا قَضَى زَيْدٌ مِنْهَا وَطَرًا. Zayd ibn Haritha radiallahu anh is named in the Quran. Think about this. It's one thing if the name of the Prophet ﷺ is taken away from you. There's not a lot that you can have that's a greater honor than that. Other than your name is referenced in the Quran. That for 1400 plus years, when people are seeking to earn the reward of finishing the reading of the Quran, your name is mentioned. When people are reciting Salat al-Taraweeh in the masjid and they are continuing to read the Quran, the name of Zayd ibn Haritha is clearly referenced in the Quran. What an honor. He had an honor. He was given this honor of being the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ. But there was legalities, there was realities that existed. And when that was removed from him and taken away from him, Zayd radiallahu an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not say, okay, just go be a good Muslim, Zayd. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put his name. His name was in and is in to this day the Quran, recited in the Quran. What a blessing. Could you imagine to have such an honor? And no other companion, not Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, though he's referenced, not Umar radiallahu anhu, not Uthman radiallahu anhu, not Ali radiallahu anhu, no other companion but one is referenced in the Quran. It's a beautiful lesson. And Zayd radiallahu anhu, he lived a decent life. He lived a life where he had a son, Osama ibn Zayd, who was one of the most beloved companions to the Prophet ﷺ. And he, in spite of his young age, the Prophet ﷺ trusted him with commanding an army. So the legacy of Zayd radiallahu anhu carried forward not just from his lineage, but because his name comes in the Quran. There are few honors greater. And Zaid radiallahu an, when he finally was martyred at the Battle of Mut'ah, the beginning that he had as a slave, as someone kidnapped, taken away, it didn't seem like a great beginning. But the ending that he had was the best ending one could ask for. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to follow the example of companions like Zaid radiallahu anhu. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. There are some lessons that we can take from a very abridged telling of the life of Zaid ibn Harith radiallahu anhu. And the first is that where life takes you may not be where you wanted it to be. You may have had expectations in your life that you would go one direction, that you would go that place, you would become this, you would do that. But where you end up, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts you, if you have faith, if you are cognizant, if you recognize, that ending can be far better than what you could have imagined. Zayd radiallahu an, being Ibn Muhammad for him was valuable before prophethood, before the Prophet ﷺ received revelation. It became even more valuable from a societal perspective when he was then Ibn Muhammad, when the Prophet ﷺ became and started to share that message of Islam. But when it was taken away from him, he could have said, no, it's not fair, this isn't right, how can this happen? But he didn't. He didn't try to argue. He didn't try to say, why is this happening? I don't get this, I don't understand. He said, Sami'na wa ata'na. He said, I hear what the Quran says and I obey. If this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am Zayd ibn Haritha, I am not Zayd ibn Muhammad. This is what's right. And through his conviction, through his faithfulness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then granted him that honor that was far better than even being Ibn Muhammad. To be referenced, to be named in the Quran. Where life takes you may not be where you thought, but if you allow yourself to have faith that this is what's best, follow that path, seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will make it far better than you could have imagined. The second is that even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes something away in your life, that if you have something that you loved, you have something that you truly care for, and it goes away from you, it's taken away from you, you wish that you still had it, know that Allah will not replace it with anything except that it's better for you. This is a rare promise that if you reflect on the idea that those who don't have Islam in their lives, they don't believe this. So when something is taken away from them, what do they think? I've lost this thing forever that was the best possible thing for me. Whereas someone with Islam in their hearts is going to say, this was taken away from me, but I know Allah will give me better, so inshallah it'll be all right. I'm going to ask the brothers to scoot up, fill in the space in front. Still brothers coming in. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes something away from you, know this, He will replace it with something better. If you lose a parent, if you lose a family member, if you lose a friend, you will receive something far better. There's a beautiful narration where the Prophet ﷺ says that it is the promise of Allah that if Allah takes the best friend of an individual, someone who is so close to their heart, if He takes them away from them and they bear it for His sake, they don't say, why, I wish this person was still here, why can't Allah have taken them later, it's too soon. They don't say these things. The Prophet ﷺ said, if they bear it with sabr for the sake of Allah, He will give them nothing other than Jannah. Whatever He takes away, He will always replace with something better. And lastly, it's not about how you start. It's not about the middle of the story. It's about the ending. It's about the ending. Actions are by بِخَوَاتِمِهَا, by their end. When an action, when you do something with sincere intention, desire to do it for the sake of Allah, if you start that way, that's great. But if in the middle you get a little turned around, you start having an intention for something else, and you end it with that intention, that's the reward that you're going to receive. But if you begin an intention one way, maybe you get turned around in the middle, but by the end of it you remember, I'm doing this for the sake of Allah, then actions are by their ending. And so where you end is far more important than where you began. This applies whether it's a deed that we're doing, whether it's where you are in your life, where you feel you are as an individual in your spirituality. Where you are is not what's important, but where you finish is. And if we all look at the example of Zaid radiallahu anhu, yes, rocky start, a little bit better as it went along, much better. But then seemingly, it got worse. Where did it finish though? It finished with him as a martyr fi sabilillah, with his name being recited in the Quran until the end of days. What better could you ask for? We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for all of our shortcomings. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the best ending. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to follow the example of companions like Zaid radiallahu anhu. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidun Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidun Majid. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتوب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم واشكروه يزدكم واستغفروه يغفر لكم واتقوه يجعل لكم من أمركم مخرجا. أقيموا الصلاة.